So imagine you're walking into this dilapidated, just freezing old schoolhouse in rural West Germany. And it's 1971. You think you're visiting a rock band, but the scene in front of you looks way more like a mad scientist's laboratory that's been, I don't know, crossed with an electronics salvage yard.
Yeah, wires everywhere.
Exactly. There are guys surrounded by literal miles of brown magnetic tape just unspooled all over the floor, and one of them is wielding a razor blade, painstakingly slicing a microsecond of a drum fill and taping it directly to the recorded sound of a washing machine.
Which is such a wild visual.
Right. And they aren't trying to write a catchy chorus, they're trying to obliterate the very concept of what a song even is.
It's an incredibly visceral image, and I mean, it perfectly encapsulates the psychology of that specific era. You have this younger German generation living in this profound, suffocating cultural vacuum left behind after World War II,
Yeah.
and they're looking across the water at the massive success of British and American rock and roll. But instead of just blindly adopting that sound, which, would have been the easy route, they felt this deep existential need to wipe the slate clean.
To build something completely their own.
Exactly. They needed an identity that was totally unburdened by the past and uninfluenced by the imported pop culture of the Allied forces.
And that search for a new identity is the grounding point for our deep dive today. We are exploring how a band called Faust took the traditional rock format, threw it into a metaphorical blender of noise and tape splicing, and essentially laid the groundwork for modern music production.
Which is no small feat.
Not at all. We're anchoring this whole conversation in a brilliant retrospective published in May 2026 by Monumental Movement Records. It's titled, What Was Faust? The German avant-garde that dismantled rock with noise and experiments. It argues that Faust didn't just play music, they turned recording into a hostile science experiment. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
If you know anything about the 1970s German experimental scene, which the British press somewhat condescendingly dubbed Krautrock, you probably already know heavy hitters like Can or Kraftwerk or New. But Faust was doing something fundamentally different, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the bands you mentioned were certainly pushing boundaries. They were taking rock music and stretching it out with early synthesizers or extending jams into these hypnotic, futuristic soundscapes.
I like driving down an endless highway.
Right. They wanted to expand the highway of rock and roll. Faust, on the other hand, wanted to blow up the highway.
I love that.
Their approach was purely destructive and collage-like. They didn't want to play better rock music. They wanted to dismantle the structural integrity of a rock song to see what it looked like when it bled.
Which is such a great framing, but it immediately raises a huge logistical question for me. Like, how does a band whose primary goal is sonic destruction even exist in a capitalist, profit-driven label system?
Well, they usually don't.
Right. You don't just walk into a major record label in 1970, hand them a tape of a washing machine and some static and say, hey, give us a budget.
No, you definitely don't. And that's where the architect of Faust really comes in. The central figure behind the band's creation wasn't even a musician. It was a music journalist and producer named Nettelbeck.
Oh, a journalist.
Yeah. He had this highly academic, almost militant goal to orchestrate something completely unprecedented in German music. He actively scouted and assembled the musicians himself. You had Werner Zappi, Dirmaner on drums, Jean-Hervé Perron on bass,
Rudolf Sosna on guitar.
right, Hans-Joachim Ermler on keyboards, and Günther Wüsthof on electronics.
He practically cast a movie. It's like Ocean's 11, but for avant-garde noise artists.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And Nettelbeck was, frankly, a master manipulator. He managed to convince Polydor Records, which was a massive mainstream label, that this band was the future.
Which is insane to think about.
It really is.
Yeah.
He negotiated this wildly unprecedented contract that prioritized endless experimentation over any actual commercial deliverables. And most importantly, that Polydor money bought them their isolation. It funded that old schoolhouse in Wumi.
Right, the Wimmy Lab. And we really need to drill down into the mechanics of this space because from what the MMRP says, it wasn't just a rehearsal room.
Not at all.
Like in standard 1970s commercial recording studios, time was money. You were paying hundreds of dollars an hour. The pressure was immense to go in, play your 4/4 rock song perfectly in one take, and just get out.
But in Wimi, Faust basically removed the clock entirely. It was a communal living space merged permanently with their recording gear. They didn't write a song in the living room and then go, record it in the studio.
The recording was the writing.
Yes. The active recording was the writing process. They would play these sprawling, chaotic improvisations for hours on end, day and night. The magnetic tape was simply always rolling, capturing every mistake, every ambient noise, every moment of brilliance.
And here's where those razor blades come in. They would take those hours of raw tape and they would physically cut it.
Literally splicing it together.
Yeah, it's like a film director shooting hundreds of hours of random, unscripted footage and then attempting to stitch together a coherent movie in the editing room. They were building tracks through physical, destructive editing rather than just a live performance.
Which was revolutionary for a rock band.
But wait, let me challenge the core premise here for a second. The MMR retrospective notes that they were heavily influenced by musique concrète. You know, the 1940s practice pioneered by Pierre Schaeffer, where you take raw recordings of trains or street noise and manipulate the tape speed to turn them into compositions.
Right, the early electronic avant-garde.
Exactly. So if Faust is using those highly academic electronic modern art techniques, why even use electric guitars and drum kits? Why not just be a pure modern art installation? Weren't they just sort of pretending to be a rock band?
What's fascinating here is the collision itself. That contradiction is the entire point of Faust. Because, I mean, if they had just been a group of modern classical composers manipulating tape in some sterile university lab, nobody would remember them the way we do today.
That's fair.
Their genius was taking the highbrow, intellectual rigor of musique concrète, the tape manipulation, the environmental sounds, and violently smashing it into the lowbrow, sweaty, visceral chaos of psychedelic rock and blues.
They wanted it all.
Yeah, they wanted the aggression of a fuzz guitar directly alongside the academic precision of a tape splice.
And you can really hear that violent collision right out of the gate on their 1971 debut album, which is simply titled Faust. If you listen to it today, it still sounds completely unhinged.
Oh, it really does.
You'll hear a standard rock groove start up, and just as your brain says, okay, yeah, I can tap my foot to this, the tape suddenly reverses. A harsh blast of static hits your speakers, and it just cuts to an unscripted recording of a casual conversation.
They completely blurred the boundaries between songs, and they actually extended that philosophy to the physical object of the record itself.
Oh, the packaging.
Yes. They released the album in a transparent vinyl jacket. The record itself was pressed on clear vinyl, and printed on the sleeve was just an X-ray image of a human hand.
Which is such a brilliant, hostile design choice. Because when you buy a rock record, you expect, a glamorous photo of the band looking like rock gods. And Faust gives you literal bones.
Right, they were stripping away the myth, the packaging, the whole commodity of rock music, and showing you the skeletal structure underneath.
Exactly. It was a literal statement of transparency. They were basically saying, this isn't a polished product for you to consume. This is the raw anatomy of sound.
Which is a bold move for a debut album on a major label.
Seriously. So they established this baseline of total sonic deconstruction in 1971. You would expect a band like that to either descend further into pure, unlistenable white noise or just immediately get dropped by Polydor. But as we move into 1972, they do something far weirder. They pivot toward pop music. Or at least, they weaponize pop music.
That is the perfect way to describe their second album so far. On the surface, the tracks are much more compact. They actually had defined beginnings and ends, which is a shock after the first record.
Yeah, actual track lengths.
But they weren't trying to write radio hits. By 1972, Faust had fully mastered the rules of conventional pop structure, and they decided to use those exact rules to deconstruct the genre from the inside out.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the track, It's a Rainy Day, Sunshine Girl, you hear what initially sounds like an incredibly catchy song. It has this very simple, repetitive lyric. It has a steady beat. But if you actually sit with the track, it induces this profound feeling of anxiety.
It really does.
The MMR piece points out that the atmosphere is deeply unstable. It feels like the entire song is teetering on the edge of a cliff. It's like building a beautiful, seemingly sturdy house purely to invite people inside and show them how the foundation wobbles and sways in the wind.
And the architecture of that wobbling foundation comes down directly to the mechanics of Zappy Diermeier's drumming.
Oh, let's talk about Zappy.
He plays this remarkably simple, mechanical beat, but he repeats it endlessly, without the standard rock fills or dynamic shifts you expect in a pop song. It creates this hypnotic, trance-like state, but what makes it feel like it's going to collapse is what happens around that beat.
Right. If you compare Faust to their contemporaries, New, it really illuminates this. New was famous for the motoric beat, this relentless driving 4/4 drum pattern.
The quintessential krautrock beat.
Exactly. But when Neo played it, it felt like sleek forward momentum. It felt like you were in a sports car cruising down the Autobahn.
You used repetition to build a futuristic drive.
Yeah.
Faust used repetition to build unbearable tension.
Yes.
Just when you settle into Zappy's groove, the band will intentionally sabotage it. They might throw a sudden jarring burst of dissonance into the mix, or momentarily shift the time signature, or just drop an aggressive piano chord completely off the beat.
It's so unsettling.
It is.
Yeah.
If Neuer's was a sleek, perfectly paved highway, Faust was an experimental road full of potholes, constantly threatening to break your axle.
They just utterly refused to let the listener get comfortable. And they weren't just doing this audibly. During this era, they were highly multimedia, right?
Oh, definitely. They made these surreal short films to accompany the tracks on so far. They featured the band members performing absurd, disjointed actions. They understood that music didn't exist in a vacuum. It was a conceptual performance.
Which is a level of artistic purity that is incredible to observe, but incredibly difficult to monetize.
Very difficult.
Which brings us to the inevitable crash. You have a deeply anti-commercial band making panic attack pop music, completely alienating mainstream listeners. So how on earth did they end up infiltrating the bedrooms of half the teenagers in the United Kingdom in 1973?
Through what has to be one of the most audacious, accidental marketing stunts in music industry history.
The Virgin Records deal. Okay, so Faust parts ways with Polydor and signs with a brand new UK label called Virgin Records, which was run by a very young Richard Branson.
Right.
And Virgin decides to release the Faust tapes, but instead of pricing it like a standard full-length LP, they sell it for 48 pence, the price of a 7-inch single.
Which was practically giving it away.
Wait, let me just look at the economics of this. Selling a full-length, heavyweight vinyl album for the price of a single. That sounds like absolute commercial suicide for a young label. How did Virgin justify the math on a stunt like that for an unknown German avant-garde band?
Well, it was a classic loss leader strategy, but taken to an absolute extreme. Virgin was a brand new label at the time. They desperately needed to establish an identity as the home of the underground, the radical, the cutting edge.
Buying street cred.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They took a massive financial hit on the manufacturing of the Faust tapes, knowing that sheer curiosity would drive sales. And the strategy worked flawlessly. I mean, if you were a casual music fan in 1973 and you saw a full album for pocket change, you bought it purely because you had nothing to lose.
It resulted in massive chart-topping sales.
Over 100,000 copies sold.
But of course, the people buying this cheap record had absolutely no idea what they were taking home. It was mass confusion across the UK because the Faust tapes wasn't an album of songs.
No, not even close.
It was the ultimate unfiltered culmination of their Wimmy lab experiments. It was heavily influenced by daddyism and the surrealist movement.
It is a profoundly disorienting listen.
Yeah.
It's entirely a collage. You might have 10 seconds of a heavy, fuzz-drenched rock riff, and then the tape literally snaps into a recording of a woman speaking French.
It's out of nowhere.
Right, which then jump cuts into a chaotic drum solo, which then dissolves into the sound of a lawnmower.
It's basically a 1970s version of a chaotic TikTok feed, just endlessly scrolling through disparate audio clips, but executed entirely by hand with razor blades and adhesive tape.
That is a stunningly accurate modern equivalent. But the crucial detail here is that it wasn't random. When you listen closely, those razor-sharp edits are painstakingly deliberate.
They knew exactly what they were doing.
Yeah, they were meticulously destroying traditional musical order to construct a completely new surrealist logic.
And their work ethic was insane because that wasn't even their only release in 1973. They also dropped Faust the Fourth, which is largely considered their masterpiece.
That's a brilliant record.
This album opens with a staggering 12-minute track literally titled Krautrock. It's this massive, droning epic of repetitive drums and bass completely submerged in layers of phasing noise and guitar feedback. It basically became the flag bearer for the entire German experimental movement.
And yet, on that exact same album, you have a track like The Sad Skinhead.
Oh, that song is so strange.
It perfectly showcases their refusal to play by the rules. It sounds like an attempt at a straightforward, reggae-tinged pop song. but the guitars are plinking and slightly out of tune. The rhythm feels completely stiff and unnatural, and there is this pervasive, unsettling weirdness to the entire recording.
It proves that Faust was more than capable of writing a normal, melodic song. They just actively chose not to let it resolve normally.
Exactly. They were fully in control of the discomfort.
But the reality of the music business eventually catches up. You can't be a signed band surviving on cheap, chaotic collages forever. Virgin Records got the edgy reputation they wanted, but eventually they needed a return on their investment. They demanded accessible music. They wanted commercial hits.
And Faust, to their immense credit, absolutely refused. Their core philosophy was fundamentally incompatible with commercial demands. That tension fractured the relationship with the label and eventually the band itself, leading to their hiatus in 1975.
But the brilliant part is that the damage was already done. They'd already planted the virus in the UK underground.
Oh, absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Faust tapes was essentially a Trojan horse.
Oh, I see exactly where you're going with this.
Virgin's pricing stunt took this incredibly radical, anti-establishment tape splicing experiment and snuck it directly into the record collections of thousands of everyday teenagers across Britain.
Teenagers who would eventually start their own bands.
Exactly. Faust demonstrated that you didn't need technical perfection, expensive studio polish, or even traditional songwriting ability to make something compelling. You just needed raw ideas, impulse, and a willingness to break things. That exact ethos directly fueled the British post-punk movement that would explode just a few years later.
Which brings us perfectly to the final and really the most important question. Why does a German avant-garde band that fell apart in 1975 matter to you listening to this deep dive right now?
It matters because their influence is foundational to how we consume and create music today. In the 1980s, as genres like post-punk, industrial, and noise music started to solidify, artists began looking backward to find their philosophical ancestors. And they discovered Faust.
The retrospective notes that heavyweights like Throbbing Gristle, Cabaret Voltaire, This Heat in the UK, and eventually Sonic Youth in the US essentially worshipped Faust. They adopted them as their founding fathers.
I absolutely did.
But it goes way beyond just inspiring other weird rock bands. The MMR piece distills Faust's legacy into three distinct pillars that completely anticipated modern digital music. The first is recording as composition.
Right, think back to the Wimmy Lab. Faust didn't treat the recording tape as a passive mirror to reflect a live performance. The tape itself was the primary instrument.
Right.
They constructed songs from isolated, disparate fragments. When you look at a digital audio workstation today, a DIW like Ableton Live, Logic, or Pro Tools, you are essentially looking at a digital representation of the Wimmy studio floor.
That is such a profound realization. Every time an artist drags, drops, slices, pitches up, or layers an audio sample on a digital grid, they are utilizing the exact philosophical framework that Faust invented with razor blades in 1971.
It's all the same concept, just updated technology.
The second pillar is embracing failure. Before Faust, noise was the enemy of the recording engineer. You tried to eliminate tape hiss, amp hum, mistakes, but Faust left the noise in. They amplified it.
Because they realized that audio artifacts possess their own emotional weight. Noise can be a structural texture. That fundamental shift in perspective paved the way for modern lo-fi culture.
Which is huge today.
It is. It's why artists today will purposefully add digital vinyl crackle or tape saturation to a pristine recording. They are seeking the warmth and realism of imperfection that Faust championed.
And the third pillar is genre defiance. They cross psychedelic rock with pure noise, manipulated electronica, and conceptual modern art. They refused to be put in a box, which made them permanently unclassifiable, and therefore permanently irrelevant.
Which explains why they didn't just fade away into a Wikipedia footnote. Faust actually reunited in the 1990s and continued their wildly improvisational, chaotic live performances well into the 2000s. Their spirit never aged because they were never tethered to the superficial trends of the 1970s to begin with.
So what does this all mean for you? If you've ever opened GarageBand on your phone and moved a drum loop around, or if you've ever chopped up an audio clip to make a video on TikTok, or even if you're currently working while listening to a lo-fi hip-hop playlist that features intentional tape hiss, you are living in the world Faust built.
They completely rewrote the grammar of music production. They prioritized the search for music that doesn't exist yet over the safety of easily digestible hits.
They looked at a blank canvas, and instead of painting a landscape, they set the canvas on fire and recorded the sound of it burning.
And that requires an incredible bravery. To dare to ask, Who decreed that a song must have a chorus? Who decided that noise is a flaw? By relentlessly challenging those basic assumptions, they expanded the vocabulary of music for everyone who followed.
Faust looked at the rigid, established rules of their era and completely dismantled them. So, as you go about your day, think about your own life, your career, or your creative hobbies. What unbreakable rules or standard operating procedures are you blindly following right now just because that's how it's always been done? And what incredible, weird new thing might you create if you finally decided to take a razor blade to the tape and rearrange the pieces? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.